Welcome to another instructional video from McFatter Tech Musser. I hope you enjoy these videos. I've gotten a lot of good feedback on them. Today, what we're going to do is I'm going to walk you through how I go about setting up the environment to do all the instructional labs for the 70-742 content. So I've got those virtual machines already configured in my Hyper-V, but for a different lab. Now, some of the machines that I'm running, we don't need access to. For example, this Tor DC, I was just doing some cleanup. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to shut this down because we're going to build some new machines. This Tor SVR1, I'm going to shut that down as well. We'll be making a new machine there. I'm going to leave the Lund DC and the NA router run. They're for my 70-740 labs that I'm currently recording videos for as well. So how do I go about creating a lab environment quickly? I mean, if we have to sit there and we have to load up an ISO, we have to install our operating system and create a partition and go through all the setup process, that takes time. You know what? When you're working in an environment, you want, whether it's a test environment or whether it's a production environment, you want to turn up servers as quickly as possible. Well, here's what I've done. What I did was, back in December, I downloaded an eval copy of Windows 2016. I opened it up, I set it up, I configured it, I go through everything that everybody goes through. And I set the time zone to Eastern time because that's, I'm on the East Coast. When we install, I don't care whether it's Windows Server or Windows Desktop, where is Microsoft located? Redmond, Washington, right? Well, where's state of Washington? It's on the west coast of the United States. So when you install Windows the first time, it wants to set the time zone to Pacific. They had to pick a time zone. Why not where they're located? So we changed that. We changed it to Eastern time zone. We make sure our time's correct. We may make some other changes. I would go into an admin command prompt and run sconfig, and I would turn off the ability to download Windows updates. That's the only way you can do that with Windows Server 2016. You open up either PowerShell or an admin command prompt, either way admin, and you run sconfig. You press enter. You'll get a little option menu. You do option number 5, and that gives you the ability to select M for manual downloads. It turns off the automatic downloads of Windows updates. If we're working in a test environment, we don't need to slow our systems down worrying about Windows updates. It's a test environment, right? Now, if that test environment is to replicate a production environment, another story entirely, right? Okay. All right. So what I do is for example, I took that Windows 16 and I fully patched it prior to turning off the ability to download updates. So at least I know I'm up current, or at least current to when I created that disk. Once I've got it configured the way I want it, I then want to sysprep that parent, what's going to become my parent disk. I'm going to not use an individual disk for each one of my servers. I'm going to do differencing disks in my virtual environment. We're going to create a parent-child relationship between our running servers and where it grabs its binaries from. So you say, where do you get that? Well, if I go and I type in c:\Windows/system32/sysprep, there's the sysprep folder, and right here is sysprep. It's on every copy of Windows that's made nowadays. You open that up and you leave it selected to enter the system out of box experience. That's the OOBE. That's what we see when we first turn on a new computer. But we want to select Generalize, and that strips the SID. It gets rid of anything that I made that might keep it unique. And then we also select Shutdown because we don't want it to start back up. Once we've done that, we've got a copy of Windows that if we wanted to, we could right click and copy and paste as many copies of that VHD as we want and start them up. And each one will be a unique installation of Windows Server when we do so. But there's an easier way to do that in a virtual environment. Now obviously I'm not going to Sysprep my Windows 10 machine, so I'm going to cancel. Once it shuts down, I go into properties for that vhdx and I flag it as read-only because I don't want to accidentally access this disk and make changes to it because that could cause corruption. This is going to be a reference. Then we go into our HyperV Manager and we say new hard disk. And we're going to create it, and we're going to, instead of just the typical dynamically expanding disk, we're going to do differencing. And for this experiment, we're going to do 70-742, and my first machine is going to be my domain controller. So I'm going to call it 7-742 lun-dc1. We'll click Next. It says, hey, who's the parent disk? So we're going to browse to that, and right there is the parent. We select it. And we can see that instead of a standalone disk that's going to increase in size as we install Windows to it, the only thing that is going to be written to this 70-742 lun-dc1 vhdx is what is unique about it compared to the base parent disk. We click Finish. Let's go ahead and do that a couple more times. We're going to go hard disk, we're going to go next, next, differencing, 70-742, and it's lun-svr. In fact, I'm going to copy that so I don't have to paste it again or type it again. Next, browse, win, parent, next, next, finish, hard disk, next, next, differencing. We're going to paste to find our parent and finish. And we've got one more to create here that's going to have the same naming convention. That's 3. Actually, you know what? There is not even a server 3 that we're using with this. The next one we're going to do is our tor-dc1. And again, we get a parent, point to that parent. And another hard disk. Next, next, differencing, and 70-742. And this one's going to be tray-dc1. And we browse our parent. And we've got one final machine that we're going to use in our 742 exercises, and that is when we're working with certificates and creating subordinates and such. We're going to create a server named ca-svr1. And of course we're going to browse, we're going to select that parent disk. So we're creating a parent-child relationship. The parent takes care of its children, right? Let's take another look back on that folder now. Here is all those hard disk images that we just created. We can see they start off, they're 4 megabytes in size. Our parent is less than 11 gigabytes in size. That was a fully operational server. Look up here at my operational DC1 that I've been using for my 70-740 labs. It's only 4 gigabytes in size. My SVR1 less than 4, SVR2 less than 4. If if I was configuring my individual servers, each one of them would take at least that 10.5 gig plus whatever you see here. So if I were to create a standalone Lund DC1, Server 1, Server 2, Server 3, and Server 4, that's 5 servers, I could expect to consume about 75 gig of storage minimum. Around that, right? 10.5, as we can see here, plus another 4, that's almost 15 gig right there. If that's the average size, 5 times 15, 75 gig. What do we have? We've got 4, 8, 12, 16, we'll call it 20, 30. So instead of consuming 75 gigabytes of storage at minimum, we're only consuming 30 gigabytes of storage. It's much more efficient. Now what do? We go New, Virtual Machine, Next, and we're going to call it 70-742 Lund-DC1. We're going to hit Next. It's going to be a Gen 2. We're going to leave the memory and the dynamic memory alone. We will use dynamic memory, startups 1024, and we're going to connect it to our London network. I already created this virtualized switch. If you don't understand how to do our virtualized switches and networking in HyperV, I encourage you to watch my lessons on it. Now, instead of creating a new virtual disk, we're going to use an existing virtual disk. We're going to point to that Lund DC1. We're going to click Next and Finish. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off, oh, I created a checkpoint. I didn't want to do that. Let's get rid of that. Okay, what I want to do is I want to go into Settings, and what I want to do is I want to turn off the automatic checkpoints. Here again, if we were in production, maybe that's what we want to do. For my test environment, let's get rid of them. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to connect to that, and I'm going to start it. We're not going to see the normal setup routine. Did it ask us to press any key to run setup? No. We're already right past that part. This thing's getting ready to set itself up. Starting services, getting devices ready, getting ready. We'll come back to that in a moment. Let's create some more virtual machines. 70-742. In fact, you know what? I can just paste and call it 1. Gen 2, enter, connect it to the London network, use an existing, browse. There's my SVR1. Next, Finish, Settings, turn off the use of automatic checkpoints, New, Virtual Machine, Next, paste the letter 2, number 2, Gen 2, enter, Lund network, use an existing, browse, next, finish. This will come up in a few moments. Let's go ahead, we're going to start server 1. I'm going to start server 2 as well. We'll go ahead and connect to it. It's running setup. And we're running our setup. We're not being asked to format a disk. We're not being asked any of that. In a matter of a few moments, it's going to be up and we're going to have operational servers. And look, we're setting up. It's using that base memory right now. That's all it's doing. We're pulling some CPU usage. Why do we do virtualization? Because we rarely ever stress all our components. We've got 5 servers running on this system, and only because of the fact that we're doing setup are we pulling this much CPU usage. We're going to go accept. We're going to do our standard password. And there we are. Just that quickly, we've got machines set up. These are ready. These should be ready to log in as well. And almost simultaneously, there they are, ready to set up. And we'll jump back over to number 2, or actually SVR1. We'll connect to that. We'll connect to this. We're ready to log in and start setting up our environment. So what's the first thing we need to do? Well, one of the first things we need to do is we want to define a gateway, because doing these exercises, we're going to be doing some downloads. Now, we're going to download to one server. So technically, we only need to define a gateway address for one of the servers, but we'll define it for all of them. What we will do is we're going to go into, it already detected our network, right? Remember that we're on the same segment as our other environment that I'm running that DC1 at. It's handed me an IP address. So you know what? I want to shut that down because I don't want that to be giving me IP addresses. We're going to use a different subnet. That 70-740 exercises I'm doing, we're using a Class C subnet, and I want to use a Class B. So this is our DC1. It's going to be our domain controller. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to set the static IP address. And that static IP address is going to be 172.16.10. We're going to leave it be a Class B address. The gateway address is 172.16.0.250. Oops, sorry. .250. And this is going to be our DNS server. So I want to point to myself. I'm going to put in my local loopback for the DNS server. That says, hey, talk to yourself. Do that, do that. If we take a look, there's our IP address. What we got to do, since this is going to be a domain controller, we want to change the name before we do anything else. We're going to go ahead and I named it wrong. Oh boy. Well, let's go ahead and accept that, and I'm going to rename it as soon as it starts back up. It's going to come up pretty quick. So while that's happening, I'm going to jump over to SVR2. We'll let that get logged in. Remember, right now the only identification is the names of the virtual machines. Doesn't take too long. Let's get back into that, and we're going to give it the correct name. That's a little bit more like it. We can't join it to a domain. We haven't created a domain yet, right? I'm going to click close. You know what? Before we start, let's just make sure that I can ping through the gateway. Anybody know what 8.8.8 is? Yeah, right. It's Google, right? How about this one? Might not have ever heard of that IP address. Now, we can't resolve it yet, can we? That's a backbone router on the internet. Maybe we'll look at that when we come back up and once we get our DNS set up and have some forwarders and such. Let's go ahead and get this restarted. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to set the IP addresses on these machines. Our SVR1 is going to be 0.21. and it's going to end up pointing to our domain controller. So we'll go ahead and get that assigned now. That way, once we've got our domain services installed, we'll be good to go. We'll do the same thing over here on our SVR2. I'm not going to set those other machines up yet. Doing these three should be enough for our exercise for you to understand how we go about doing this. Okay, so we've got that IP assigned. We'll refresh just to make sure it stuck correctly. There it is. We'll refresh that one. There it is. Let's come back over here. Let's get logged in. Okay, looks good. Now, what's the next step? We've got it named. We've got a static IP address. Let's make this our domain controller. We're going to install Active Directory domain services. We're going to add the features. That gives us management capabilities. I'm also going to go ahead and select DNS Server right now, even though it'll be done automatically for us when we promote this to being a domain controller. We're going to add also the DHCP server, but that'll be the very last thing that we configure. But this way, everything's already installed for us. We're going to do next, 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 and install. This is going to take a minute or two to install. Installing it doesn't really take too long. It's the configuration that takes a little bit longer. So as soon as the feature and role installation is done, I'll be back. So I'm going to pause the video right now. Okay, well that only took about 45 seconds or so. I'm running on SSDs, so this runs pretty fast. Before we go any further, let's take a look and see what our disks have done. I'm going to go and I'm going to open that back up. Let's get back over to that virtual hard disk file folder. Our DC1 is now 2.6 gigs in size. Our server 1's 2 gigs. I must not have turned off automatic checkpoints. Got to do that. I'll have to merge that in when I shut it down, make sure get that taken care of. But you can see if we had installed from our medium, from a DVD or from an ISO, we would already be up somewhere in the 12 to 13 gigabyte in size. We would have already consumed 36 gigabytes or so of storage on our whatever we're storing to. It's much more efficient. We're going to add a new forest. We're going to call it a datum.com. First domain controller. In the first domain, it's a new forest. We're not adding to an existing domain. We're not adding a new domain to an existing forest. First domain controller, first domain, add a new forest. It's going to check, make sure there's no conflicts. We have to provide some type of directory services restore mode password. Keep in mind, here again, in production, you're not going to use a generic password. We're doing a test environment, we will. We can see that it will have a DNS server installed, and it'll also be a global catalog. You have to have at least one global catalog in every site. And remember that each site should have 2 domain controllers. Why? What happens if one goes down? If you lose your domain controller and it's your only domain controller, nobody does anything on your network, or at least with great limitation. Warning, delegation for this DNS server cannot be created because the authoritative parent zone cannot be found. Well, have we created any other DNS zones? No. That's why we're getting that message. We're just going to click next. It's going to verify. Say, hey, you like the NetBIOS name? A datum? Yeah, sure, we'll stick with that. I think that is what we want. We're going to click next. Now, the next thing it's going to tell us is where it's going to store the database and the log files and the sysvol folder. If this was a production machine for me, I would not be using the C drive. Why wouldn't I want to do that? Well, that's where the operating system's at. I want this machine as a domain controller to be as efficient as possible. So what I'm going to do is I would create a second disk, or I would have a second disk installed, and I would offload the processing and the throughput needs of the database folder and the log files and the sysvol. Maybe move it to d:/ntds and d:/sysvol. Get it off of your operating system drive. Let that thing work as efficiently as possible. For our test environment, we're simply going to accept that. We're going to click Next. We can see what we're going to do. Keep in mind that you could always do this through PowerShell. You don't have to do it through the GUI. You could save this PowerShell script and modify it as necessary for whatever you need to do as far as deploying domain controllers. We're going to click Next. It's going to verify that everything is there that we need. Should come back with a green check mark that we're good to go with some warnings. Yep, there's our green prerequisite checks passed successfully. Gives us some warnings talking about encryption and such. The bottom line is we passed everything completely. We're good to go. We click Install. Now what it's going to do is it's going to create our domain partitions. It's going to start creating all those objects that it takes for us to have a domain. It's going to install the group policy management console. It's going to create the DNS integrated zones. There's that directory partition beginning to be installed. There's our DNS name, Kerberos policy, all the different things that's needed to make this a domain controller and integrate with DNS. So while this finishes, it's going to be done here within another minute or so, but there's no reason for us to just sit here and watch a little progression bar going across the screen. I'm going to pause the video. Okay, we're going to reboot, and once we're done rebooting, we'll be logging into this as the administrator for our domain. Should happen in just a few moments. Yep, there it goes. Like I said, we're running on SSDs, so reboot shouldn't take very long. Once it does restart, though, it's going to have to secure with the domain policy and such. Didn't have that before. This will take a few more moments, so as soon as we're up and ready to log in, I'll be back with the video. Okay, well, it took a couple minutes. It had to set itself up as a domain controller, but we're ready to log in. So we can simply type in administrator. Well, if I click on the VM, we can. Administrator with our same password. Pulled that in from our original credentials. And we're operational with our domain. We're about 30 minutes into the video. In actual time, we're sitting somewhere around 35 minutes. We've got a network. We've got a domain that we can do things in. What's that yellow triangle? Complete our DHCP configuration. It wants us to know who is authorized and such, and create the security groups. We commit. That's all that's necessary for that. Now, we haven't set DHCP up yet, but it's there. Let's go ahead and finish our DNS setup, because we've got DNS, but all we've got is forward lookup zones. All right, there's our DC1. It's the only system that's in our network yet. We want to be able to do a reverse lookup as well. So we're going to right click and we're going to say new zone. We're going to do next. It's going to be a primary zone. It's going to be to all DNS servers. It's going to be an IPv4. What's that network? It's a 172.16. Oh, my caps lock is not on. 172.16. I just simply hit enter. Next. Now, let's go back and take a look at that for a second. Only secure dynamic updates. This is integrated with Active Directory. We don't want non-secure updates. Only if you're integrated. So we click Next and Finish. Let's go back over to our DC1. We can double click on that. We can say Update Associated Pointer Record. If we come back to our reverse lookup, there we are. It's there already. What does that do for us? If we do a command prompt and we do a ping 172.16.0.10, we get a response. If we do a ping lun-dc1, we can resolve that to the IP address. Since we're local, it's resolving it to the IPv6. But what about resolving an IP to a host name? That's what the reverse lookup does. So if we go here and do a -A and enter, we can see that we now have full resolution in our DNS, both forward and reverse. Let's go ahead and set up our DHCP before we go any further. We want to make sure everything's operational, right? I'm going to select our server. I'm just going to move this over a little bit. We're going to select IPv4. We're going to right click on it and say New Scope. We're going to click Next. We're just going to call it a datum. What is the address range that we want to use? Now, two different ways we can do this. We could put in the entire range of addresses that are viable for our network, which on a Class B is an awful lot. Or you can restrict it. If you say we will never have the need to distribute more than 1,000 IP addresses, maybe we do something like on a class or on a /22, but we need to stay on the same type of subnet, right? But we can restrict down what we do. We're going to type in 172.16.0.160, and we'll end at 172.16.0.190. We'll leave the subnet mask at the Class B, but this way we don't have to worry about configuring exceptions. If I started at 0, on my next screen, well, it doesn't like that. It doesn't want me to do that. It would want me to create an exception. Let's see if we can. Why did it not like that? Who caught that? 0 is not an address. Can't use the first, can't use the last IP, right? Network identification, broadcast ID. Okay. If I did this and I click Next, I know my domain controller is 0.10. My SVR1 is 0.21. I can't be handing out those addresses. I'd have to configure exclusions and say from 172.16.0.1 to 172.16.0.39 or whatever. Exclude those addresses. We'll make it easy on ourselves. We're just going to type in 160 to 190. We're going to get rid of all these. We don't need to worry about exclusions now. We're going to leave the lease duration at 8 days. What happens 50% into a lease? It's when your client wants to renew, right? We are going to configure some DHCP options. So yes, I want to configure those. What's the address of our router? Our clients need to know how to get to the internet, right? Are domain names right? Are domain name server addresses correct? We can simply click Next. We're not using WINs. And yes, we do want to activate the scope. And we finish. And there we are. We've got DHCP ready to hand out addresses. Our domain controller is just about set up. What else do you think we might need to have? Now, remember, we're working in a production environment. So we're multitasking a little bit, right? We did DHCP on this server. That's something you probably wouldn't want to do in a production environment on a domain controller. Well, the other thing we're going to do is we're going to add certificate services to this domain controller. So we're going to select Active Directory Certificate Services. We're going to click Next, Next, Next. We're also going to do the web enrollment. That allows us to request those certificates using web. We're going to do Next, 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 and Install. We're going to let that install. While that's happening, I'm jumping over here to Server 1. Well, the VM's named Server 1 anyhow. I'm going to do change lun-svr1 domain at datum.com. Hit enter. Who can join it? Should take a moment. Well, there we are. It's going to tell us we have to reboot. Here we go. Let's do it over here. Remember, nowadays we can change the computer name and join it to the domain all in one step. Used to be you couldn't do that. Give me a prompt. Should be yep, there we are. We get our warning telling us, yeah, and next and enter. That's restarting. This one's already up. Now, what happens if I sign in with that administrator account? Do I sign in as a datum administrator? Watch that sign in to right underneath where the password is at. If you type in administrator as a username on a member server, it thinks you're trying to log in as the local administrator. With that in mind, I'm going back over here to our domain controller. So we're going to finish that configuration. Yes, this is who is allowed. We're going to put a check there. We're going to put a check there. It will be an enterprise CA because we're part of a domain. This is our first certificate server, so it's also our root CA. No other infrastructure before this, so we've got to create new private keys. We're going to take that key length at 2048 and use SHA-256. We'll allow these names to stay the way they are. Validity period, 5 years is fine. This is where they're going to be stored. Here again, maybe we might, if this was production, we might offload that to a different drive. Maybe a RAID array so that we've got redundancy. We're ready to go. Let's configure. Should go pretty, yep, can't even get it out of my mouth. Should go pretty quick and it's already done. We're going to close. We're going to close. We've got our domain controller, we've got our certification authority, we've got our DNS server, we've got our DHCP server. All built. Now, let's do this. We're going to go to ADUC, Active Directory Users and Computers. And I hate using that administrator account because I also teach cybersecurity and I don't want anybody logging in as administrator. I'm going to copy that account. And I'm going to, since we're in a test environment, I'm not going to make this too wild and crazy. I'm just going to call it System Administrator. And we're going to call that the SAdmin account. We're going to click Next. Here again, we're in a production environment, so I'm not too concerned about the password, but if this was a production server, a lot longer password, put complexity in there. Remember, complexity defeats the human aspect. Length defeats the computer aspect. Does a computer care whether you're typing a capital letter, a lowercase letter, a number, or a special character? It's all binary to a computer. The only thing that defeats a computer from hacking your password is length, and simply because it makes it take so long. Putting those uppercase, lowercase mixture of numbers and special characters in defeats the human element. I'm also going to say the password never expires, which here again, don't ever do in a production environment. We're going to finish. So now I can log in with that. If I wanted to, I could right click and disable or even remove the administrator account. Keep in mind, I'm still logged in as that. But now, here we go. That's logging in. That's logging in. We've got a network. Let's take a look in ADUC. There's our 2 member servers. There's our domain controller. We could start building out some user groups and some security groups and organizational units, building all our structure. We've got an operational network. Now, this is not all the servers that I would be running in 70-742. We'd also have that Tor-DC1 and the Trade-DC1 as well as the CA-SVR1. But how much longer would it take to set those 3 up? We've already got our infrastructure done. We've got our domain controller. We've got our DNS. We've got our DHCP. We've got our certification authority. We're ready to rock and roll and do whatever else we need to do. I want to thank you for taking the time to review this video. I hope you found it informative. If you enjoy these videos, please subscribe to my channel. And hopefully, as I say at almost the end of every one of my videos, I'll see you in the next lab or lesson. Take care.